As the helicopter sliced across the sky, Dan Morgan looked down on the barren landscapes of Western Antarctica. Dan is a geomorphologist, a geologist who draws clues from the shapes and chemical dating of a landscape to determine how and when it formed. The helicopter set down in a flat, snowy spot on the valley floor, and the team of geologists worked quickly to pull their gear from the craft. Empty, the helicopter rose from the snow and quickly disappeared over the valley walls. As the sound of spinning rotors faded into the distance, the desolation of the valley struck Dan.
Very few colors, no smells, no birds chirping or anything, no sounds. You don't have a sense of scale very easily. They claim that Antarctica is sort of the last wilderness, truly wild place. It does strike you sometimes as being kind of odd that you're even out there.
The next day, Dan's team struck out on their first field expedition to gather samples. They planned to collect rock samples and dig soil pits on significant landscapes throughout the valley to better understand each landscape's formation and age. As the temperature never climbed above the freezing point, the team wore thick coats, bulky gloves, and cumbersome boots everywhere.
You're like an astronaut in a totally different environment. You're the only living thing that's up and moving around, and even then you shouldn't really be here. You can only be here because you have all this sort of modern trappings that help support your life.
As days passed, Dan's mind wandered further and further from the difficult work of field collection. He thought of his wife, who would meet him upon his return for 2 weeks of vacation in the lush, vegetated hills of New Zealand.
She's supportive of me doing these things. She doesn't want me to leave her necessarily, but she's always been pretty supportive of all the traveling that I get to do.
Several days after the team's arrival in Arena Valley, Dan awoke to find a dense fog had settled over the camp. Until conditions improved, research was suspended.
The emotional parts of being isolated and not being able to talk to your family, your friends, it wears on you a little bit. And you certainly get a little bored of talking to the same people over and over again.
After 5 days, the fog lifted and field travel was again possible. The team decided to hike into nearby Beacon Valley. As the team trudged over the hills separating the two valleys, they crossed over an expansive snowfield. Looking across the snowfield in the bright light of a clear Antarctic summer day, Dan noted the pristine surface and continued his way across the snowfield and pushed over the next small rise. Suddenly, all of Beacon Valley stretched out below him.
Scientifically and geologically, what's fascinating there is that there's very little life. No gophers digging around or tree roots sort of stirring up soils at all. So this is a landscape where really you just have sort of exposure to the atmosphere and winds and changes in temperature. There are only a handful of places that are even close to this, and there's nothing quite like these dry valleys in Antarctica that way.
If Dan had arrived at this spot 100,000 years in the past or future, the landscape would have been almost identical. He was a crime scene investigator working on a cold case 1 million years old. With each rock he collected, he thought of the tiny isotopes of aluminum and beryllium peppered throughout the rock structure. The cosmogenic isotopes Dan saw in the samples were only created when atoms of aluminum or beryllium were bombarded by specific cosmic rays from space. This bombardment could only occur when a rock was exposed on the surface. By measuring the amounts of isotopes in his samples, Dan would be able to determine when each sample was exposed to the surface. These ages would allow him to determine the rates of erosion in different parts of the valley, and thus how the valley had eroded. If such erosion could be understood in Antarctica, the knowledge would allow better study of similar environments on Earth and other planets.
Earth's history is 4.6 billion years long, but plants and animals don't get onto the surface until 450, 500 million years ago. So a lot of the time, the surface actually looked just like what we see in these dry valleys in Antarctica, just barren rock. That's kind of a fun application, especially when you want to start comparing, the history of Earth to the history of Mars and what's different about it. Did Mars ever have life on it or running water? And